here.
We have a special guest joining us. You guys heard it unfolding. We are being joined by Comics Explained.
Okay.
There it is. There's
Yeah,
the voice.
I have my mic input in the wrong one. I never use Zoom, so like I have no idea how to make this work. Yeah, I love you guys. I've been watching your all's channel for like a while.
Oh, wow.
Whoa.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
That
you
is an
guys are
honor to
amazing.
hear.
Yeah, you guys are awesome.
We asked for the lurkers to come out, and man, they did.
No, it's all good. It's all good. Yeah.
How are you doing, man?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I'm doing good. Like I was just chilling here this morning and I was like, I wonder who's like live streaming today. Because like I do that. Like I'll jump on YouTube and just like look at what YouTube channels are live streaming for comics. And just like check out different comic channels. And then I saw you guys were on and I was like, oh, the comic pals are up. Like, yes, let's go check this out. Yeah. So I was just like jump in the chat and start talking to you guys. But yeah, that's a good call with Secret Invasion, by the way. Secret Invasion was really, really good.
Mm-hmm. Rob, were you actively reading comics during that era of Marvel and DC?
Dude, I've been reading comics since the 90s, man.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I started with X-Men Volume 1 way back in the day. So yeah.
I love
Yeah,
it.
Secret Invasion was really, really cool. And it was a good point that you made about like Nick Fury, because like that's exactly like the coolest thing is like if you read the tie-ins, Nick Fury figures it out before everybody else does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a good point.
So I would love to be able to do this in a more formal situation where we have you on.
Why do you want to be more formal, man? Like people love off the cuff stuff, man. Like people are just like just make it informal and just be like have a little randomness to it.
Oh, trust me, nothing excites me more than something I didn't expect. And this is the greatest kind of surprise. But we've got to do this again where we can put you on the thumbnail and really draw people to the table. But I would love if you could share with our listeners, share with us your top 5 Marvel events, because I'm very interested in hearing your reasoning.
Oh, I will. But like, this is your all's podcast, man. I want to hear what you guys have to say. And then I'll jump into my top 5. But yeah, like, I want to hear the rest of your all's top 5.
Okay, so we're doing this over the course of a few weeks. So we're going to stop at our 3s. And then I'll do my 3 since the other guys went, and then you can go with your 5.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
All right. So my number 3 is Secret Empire. Now, Secret Empire is genuinely one of my favorite comic stories. And I know that there are a lot of people who shit on Secret Empire and don't like it. And I remember the book burnings when Captain America was revealed as Hydra. I get all that. But that story that Nick Spencer was telling, going all the way back to the Pleasantville stuff, the Pleasant Hill arc where all the villains were kidnapped and taken to that place where they thought that they were living in like a perfect town, but it was really they were really prisoners. I thought all that was brilliant. And the conflict between the two Captain Americas, Steve and Sam, and the way that they were able to be shown as meaningfully different heroes with different perspectives and different ways of being Captain America, I thought all that was fantastic. And of course, the biggest piece being what I thought was a stroke of genius to take the hero of Earth, Captain America, the hero of the United States, and make him their biggest threat. And not do it in a way where it's like, oh, Cap's been bad the whole time. It's not that, but make the world think that Captain America has actually been this way the whole time. Make them believe that what he is saying is right, put the message behind that man, and take it all the way. I thought that was brilliant. I loved it. I thought it was a great way to elevate Sam Wilson's Captain America by making him the standard bearer opposition to the Hydra Cap. And I thought it really did a great job of elevating some of the characters that were introduced to us and elevated during the all new, all different era. Stellar story. I loved every second of it. And I miss those days of Nick Spencer's time as the head of Marvel. I thought Secret Empire was amazing. That's my number 3.
Also, the marketing around that had to be specific to not play the cards that, yes, it's all going to be, he'll be Cap eventually, you know, like it's not going to be that. But they had to lean into it. They had to kayfabe that to make it look like it was a legit story, which led to a lot of that pushback.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you remember, like, they had the tweets, and it was like, Captain America's like, Hail Hydra. And, like, even Chris Evans responded to the tweet, and he's like, say it ain't so. And it's just like, yeah, man, Captain America's a Hydra agent. It was amazing.
I felt like that was the last time that Marvel was really willing to push the envelope and,
Yeah.
do something that would ruffle feathers. It feels like they're, they try to keep things pretty even keeled. But I appreciate the version of Marvel that pushes the envelope, makes you think critically about the stories that are being told, and lets some risky, dangerous stuff get through those pages.
Yeah.
So, what about you, Rob? What's your top five?
Funny enough, Secret Empire is it's also my number three. But yeah, my number five favorite story, crossover event is probably Thanos Imperative. And it gets weird when you get into like the Dan Abnett era of Cosmic Marvel, because you guys are just getting into like the whole Cosmic Marvel landscape, right? Because like Annihilation is technically where it starts, where like Dan Abnett starts. So like Rocket Raccoon comes back after being an old, I think like Steve Englehart creation, maybe. I can't remember who it was that made him way back in the day, but like Star Lord comes back after being like a one-off character that looks almost nothing like he does in Dan Abnett's run. But then like Dan Abnett starts with Annihilation. I would skip Annihilation Conquest. It's okay, and if you do read it, I think it's the Phyla-Vell that's like the prelude to it, and then just go to the main event and ignore all the other tie-ins. But Thanos Imperative, because of like how Dan Abnett was doing things, every story arc was basically a crossover event. Right. And Thanos Imperative was so dope because there's this amazing moment where Rocket Raccoon confronts Thanos after they had resurrected him from when Drax killed him. And Thanos is on like this mindless rage or something like that. And Rocket Raccoon's just like, so we got a choice here, bro. Like, either you can calm down or I can drop you into a black hole and you'll just have infinite life forever. Like, you'll just live for all eternity because a black hole's not going to kill you and you'll just be alive. There'll be no way to get you out. And so eventually, like, he calms down. But for the main Thanos Imperative story itself, the coolest thing about it is it introduced like because you guys never read Thanos Imperative, do you? Did you?
I actually did.
I have, yeah.
Okay.
Think
Okay,
I
yeah.
read
So you
it,
guys all
yeah.
read it. Okay. So for those of you guys out there in the chat who never read it, like Thanos Imperative was dope because it introduced the idea of the Cancerverse, right? So
Yes.
yeah, it's like the idea where at some point, Marvel of the Kree he was supposed to die from cancer, like he did in the old 1984 story, right? Like the death of Captain Marvel from Jim Starlin, I think he wrote it. And in that alternate reality, he didn't. Instead, like him alongside all the other superheroes basically banded together and killed Mistress Death. But what it did is it laid the groundwork for like Shumagorath and the many angled ones to like enter into the universe through Doctor Strange. And so they basically possess everybody and like no one can die. And so, Thanos Imperative, of course, builds off of like War of Kings, Realm of Kings, right? The great big huge war out in space that opened like a tear, right? The fault, as they called it. And there's this amazing moment in the story where the forces of Marvel from that alternate reality are invading, and you get the Galactus engine, which is just this giant head of Galactus that comes pouring through the rift. And it was crazy. They had like killed Galactus and weaponized him. But yeah, that one was cool because it's like ultimately Thanos brings Mistress Death to like the Cancerverse, and then Mistress Death touches Marvel, kills everybody who's supposed to die, and it gets clean slated. Then Marvel ignores it; they undo it with Annihilation Scourge, and they're like, "Yep, it's still there," and never did anything with it of any real meaning. But yeah, that one was phenomenal. Number four is absolutely Annihilation, and the only reason why I would pick Annihilation as number four is because it's the first time that Marvel actually consolidates their cosmic landscape. That up until that point, it was like some Jim Starlin stories here and like some stories over there. And it's like, it very much felt like DC's cosmic landscape, where it's like, yeah, there's like aliens and people and stuff out there. But like, unless it's the Shi'ar in a Chris Claremont comic, an X-Men comic or something like that, yeah, they're just kind of doing their own thing. And Dan Abnett's like, let's bring them all together in like this giant battle, right? Where like Annihilus tries to wipe everything out. And it's cool because unlike a lot of Marvel stories at the time, where Annihilation is like, the build up and all that kind of stuff. If you jump into the main event, which I think is like the best way to do it, it just opens up with like Nova and Star Lord fleeing for their lives, leading like a refugee group, like off of a world because Annihilus has just conquered most of the universe. And then when you read Annihilation and you take a step back, right, and you look at like, my number two, or I'm sorry, my number one story, right? You look at like Civil War, then you realize that like while the universe is being laid waste to by this just ultimate nihilist, superheroes are squabbling on Earth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Over nonsense. And it's just like, dude, it's yeah, it was yeah, Annihilation was because it just it set in motion the whole cosmic landscape for Marvel under Dan Abnett, which was just an incredible, it was just incredible series of stories. But yeah, number three, absolutely Secret Empire. I love Secret Empire. Like Secret Empire was phenomenal. I mean, dude, you nailed it. Like in an evil version of Captain America, it was so cool. And what was so funny was that looking at that story when it came out, is that you had so many people who didn't know anything about it and were making judgment calls on it, where they're just like, oh my God, Marvel's doing this, garbage stuff, and it's like he's always been a Hydra. And it's like, no, like in like Avengers standoff, right? And like Assault on Pleasant Hill and all that kind of stuff. Like the Red Skull takes a cosmic cube and rewrites Captain America's history. Like that's how you get into it. The problem was the marketing for that, like the prelude to it. Like the main event Marvel marketed, but they didn't really market how you got to that point. So unless you were reading those stories from all new, all different Avengers, you had no idea how in the world you got into that. But to your point about an evil Captain America, right? If ever there were a superhero that, if they turned evil, could completely and totally dismantle the entire superhero landscape on Earth, it's Captain America because it's the last person anybody would ever expect. Like nobody ever expects a villainous Steve Rogers. Nobody ever expects him to actually be a Hydra agent in secret. And like between his battle strategy and all that stuff, and the idea that he's like, okay, so like basically we're gonna steal a Chitauri queen, we're gonna put it on Earth, and then we're gonna create a giant like force field around the planet and then send our heaviest hitters out into space to like stop this constant invasion. Well, there go those guys, right? Captain Marvel and Hyperion and all those guys, like people who could end the conflict like that, they're out there and there's no conceivable way back. And then we're just gonna like turn the world against the Avengers. And we're like, because the worthiness enchantment doesn't say like whosoever holds this hammer, if he be a good guy, shall possess the power of Thor, right? Like he picks the hammer up because he believes in the righteousness of his cause and like lays waste to the superheroes. And it's so cool. It was such a phenomenal story. The problem is that it ended so poorly, right? Because like I agree with you guys on this. Like Marvel gave in to the backlash. And you're 100% right when you say like it was the last time Marvel was willing to push the envelope. Because by the time you get to the end of the story, Marvel's like, okay, we got to like wrap this up, right? Oh, I think they're mowing grass out there. But Marvel's like, we got to wrap this up, man. Like we got to do something about this. So like in a tie-in, a cosmic cube gets coughed up, which just fixes everything, and it's just like, bro, and yeah, it was crazy. But yeah, number two, oh my God, I had it in my head as number two, and I can't remember what it is now. Oh my God, maybe it was the Onslaught Saga. I was sitting here thinking about it as I was talking about it. But you know what?
Civil War 2, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. The character assassination of Captain of Carol Danvers. Yeah.
Thank you.
The
Thank
unnecessary
you.
death of Tony Stark. Yeah. Dude, the backlash to Civil War 2, I gotta be honest, man. I don't think I've seen backlash to a comic book story like that in years.
Yeah.
In years. Like folks despise that story. And rightfully so, because it was just like this half-ass cash grab from Marvel because Captain America 3 was coming out. Right. And they're like, let's just write a story. We're like, the superheroes fight again, and we'll just call it Civil War 2, and right, it was just insanely poorly done. Yeah, no, Civil War 2 was awful. Yeah, God, if I had to pick a crossover for my number two, second only to Civil War. Ooh.
Did you call out Secret Invasion? Yes, you did, right?
Yeah, I talked about Secret Invasion earlier, but I'm trying to figure out what number two would be for me. Maybe Onslaught Saga, right? Because Onslaught was really, really fun. But it also just kind of screamed 1990s. And one of the things that I've always loved in the world of comics is just ridiculously overpowered characters. Like I've always just been fascinated by that, characters that borderline godhood. And Onslaught in and of himself wasn't necessarily a godly like character. It wasn't until he absorbed Franklin Richards and then absorbed Nate Gray that he just becomes this, has this crazy level of power. And then ultimately, the superheroes, everybody, like basically all the unpopular ones that weren't selling, everybody but the X-Men and Spider-Man, right, sacrifice their lives, and then you get Heroes Reborn from Franklin Richards and whatnot. But um I will say one crossover that I think I really enjoyed that not a lot of people talk about anymore was Original Sin.
We do on this show.
Yeah, we
Okay,
talked
you know
about that
Original
last
Sin?
week.
Okay, yeah, yeah, like Original Sin. Original Sin was great, and I don't know if it was necessarily the event itself that was so phenomenal. I think it was what came out of it that made the crossover so cool, right? Because so many things spun out of that. Everything from like, small, really fun stories where like Lockjaw finds the bone that he thought he lost to like huge moments where like Captain America remembers he was part of the Illuminati and got, his mind wiped by Steve Rogers and
Yeah.
yeah, and it's like all these just huge things that came out of the story. The what is it? That's how they introduced Angela, right, from the old Spawn myth.
Yes.
They brought her
Yeah.
over to
Yes.
Marvel. Yeah, there were just so many cool things that came out of it. I don't know if I fully agree because you guys remember. So you guys remember when Original Sin launched, Nick Fury whispers something to Thor, and Thor just isn't able to lift his hammer, right? You guys remember when they came out years later and they were like, when Nick Fury was like, well, what he said to Thor was that Gore was right. And it was the most lackluster thing
Yeah.
ever.
Horrible.
It,
Horrible.
it gave us Mighty Thor, which is fantastic, and introduced me to Russell Dodderman. Great. But that was very much like, oh God, that's what he said.
It's
Yeah.
one of those things where like the mystery is way cooler than the solution ever could be.
Yeah. And they let it go on too long. Like they just let it last too long before they answered it. And I firmly believe they ended up doing that, one, because they thought maybe there was still some traction there. Maybe it was necessary for Jason Aaron's work on Thor. But it was definitely just kind of hand wavily thrown in there. Like, Gore was right. Okay, cool. Moving on.
Right.
And like that's all you get. But yeah, so Original Sin was cool. The idea of one of the things that I thought was so cool that came out of it was the fact that we had never actually seen the real Nick Fury, right? Outside of like the
Yeah.
old school Nick Fury, Agent of Shield comics, he actually has not been in Marvel for years. And you end up realizing it's all just been life model decoys this whole time. And it's just kind of like, wow, like that was really mind blowing when that happened. The death of the Watcher and so on. But yeah, nobody ever really talks about Original Sin. And I guess there's not really a whole lot of longevity outside of the immediate aftermath to it.
It was fun.
Number one is absolutely Civil War. Civil War will always be my number one crossover in Marvel, like forever. Yeah, hands down.
Listen, I love Civil War to death. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Civil War. So if you want to expand on that, please feel free. But also, I was thinking, was your number 2 Secret Wars 2015 by chance?
Oh, that was my number two. No. It wasn't Secret. Well, it wasn't just Secret Wars. It was Hickman's event. Oh my God, Hickman's Avengers
Let's
and
go.
New Avengers.
Son. Number
Man,
two is
dude,
just Jonathan Hickman.
yeah. It's Jonathan Hickman as a writer. That's my
Yeah,
number two
yeah.
crossover event. It's just a human being who writes comics. Yeah, no, dude. Oh my God, Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers going into Secret Wars because it's all just one giant cohesive story. And that's the funny thing is technically it is an Avengers comic, right? But with the exception of New Avengers Volume One. Well, okay, so here's a funny thing. I don't know how many of you guys do this, but like when I went through, like reading it as it went along, it was an absolute nightmare to try to follow at the time. Right? Were you guys following Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers?
Yeah,
at the time?
weren't
Sure
some
enough.
issues delayed over other ones, so like it messed up
Yeah.
time and stuff.
Yeah.
It did, yeah. It totally screwed up the reading order and all that kind of stuff. And so once the whole thing was done, I actually went back and I found on I want to say either Comic Book Herald, one of those, maybe it was How to Love Comics. They had an actual like issue by issue reading order. And I was like, okay, like this is dope. And just like read through the whole thing. And once you take it issue by issue, it does get a little wonky because it's like New Avengers issues 1 through 3, and then Avengers 1 through like 6. and then New Avengers 7, and then like Avengers like 7 through 12. And so you kind of go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But with the exception of the main Avengers comic, the first story arc, and New Avengers 1 through 3, it becomes a crossover event like that. Like, I mean, it's just everybody starts appearing like all over the place. And so, yeah, I would, even though it's titled Avengers and New Avengers, I would 100% consider it like from almost beginning to end a crossover event. But to this day, as much as I still say Civil War is better, like story wise, narrative wise, and consequence wise. Um, but to this day, I have never read a crossover event that was that expansive, that complex, and kept me glued as much as Avengers and New Avengers did. But you guys having read it when it came out, I read it as it came out. I'm sure fans in the chat read it as it came out. It was exhausting, man. Like
Yeah.
it was like a 3 or 4 year long comic epic, right? And it just took forever to get to the conclusion of it all.
It was
I
heavy too. Like it wasn't lighthearted, like Black Panther's debating on whether or not to wipe out full worlds.
Yeah, yeah,
I was enthralled by that. I really loved having to sort of sit with everything that the Illuminati was considering
mhm,
every month. Like, oh shit, wow, Doctor Strange just took in all this demonic energy. What's gonna happen? I'll find out in a month or two from now. And
yeah,
I would always have to go back and read the last issue because of exactly what you're saying. But I was just so enraptured by the story that Hickman was telling and the elements that were at play. I thought it was all brilliant. I love that we got the Infinity event smack dab in the middle of that whole thing. He
yeah,
touched on so much. It's like the guy took all his thoughts on Marvel, except X-Men thoughts, and just vomited them out. And they're the greatest thoughts I've ever seen. I ate them up. I thought it was brilliant.
yeah, yeah. It was incredible. Yeah, Black Panther, and that's a funny thing too, because when you look at Avengers and New Avengers, right? And like even now when I think about it and I think back to when that comic was coming out at the time, it brings back these amazing feelings because you're like, okay, cool. So we have a month before like Avengers comes out. We'll read some Black Widow or some Punisher or some Captain America or something like that. You're reading these comics and you're like, oh, that's right. The incursions are still happening out there.
Yes.
Nobody remembers, like nobody knows, right? Outside of the Illuminati, like no one knows. And so it adds this really interesting layer of complexity to Marvel because you have all these traditional superheroes like Spider-Man and so on who are running around and doing their own thing. And then you get like Spider-Verse. And at the end of Spider-Verse, when it's all said and done and the good guys win, the inheritors are defeated, and stuck on that radiated world or whatever it is, they're just like, okay, Spider-Man UK, let's send you home. And like his whole world and universe is gone. Right. Like because I don't know if you guys remember, like in Spider-Verse, they go to send him back, they open a portal, and it's just blackness.
Yeah,
There's
it's,
nothing
it's
there.
universal
And, oh
Brexit.
my God. Yeah, it's like, holy cow, like the universal Brexit. Like the incursions caused Brexit in Spider-Man UK's universe. Yeah, it's like his whole universe was destroyed by an incursion. Like, oh my God. And so it's these just really, really cool small things. Um, but yeah, and in terms of like actual storytelling, narrative, and stakes, Civil War is where it's at. Like to me, Civil War will always be my number one story. And the reason why is because as cool as Avengers and New Avengers was, I was incredibly skeptical when they got to Secret Wars that Marvel was going to actually reboot. Like there's no way they actually I hope they do. The story is designed for them to, but I don't know if they actually will. And in the aftermath of Secret Wars, it's like all new, all different Marvel, which isn't really new or different at all, right? It's like, all the same, right? And not new Marvel, and it's just like, okay, so there were no stakes here. This was just a giant event, right? And that was it, right? Nothing that happened in the story actually mattered at all, except that I guess maybe they just brought Miles Morales over because the Ultimate Universe isn't there anymore, but you could have done that in 6 issues, right? Bendis could have just written Spider-Man 2, right? And the way that story ended could have just been like, actually, Miles, come hang out here. And Miles is like, cool, because over there is cooler than over here. And like, that's it, right? So, I mean, didn't really have any stakes at the end of Secret Wars. But with Civil War, I mean, it changed everything. The way that Marvel handled their characters and the things that came after, right? Because Tony Stark becomes director of Shield. That leads into things like Secret Invasion, right? It leads into House of M, kind of indirectly, but like coming out of House of M and all the chaos that ensued with mutants losing their powers. You go into Secret Invasion, right? Like Deadpool basically sends information off. Norman Osborn intercepts it, and then it's just like The government's like, how could you have possibly missed this, Tony Stark, right? So he gets ousted. Norman Osborn becomes director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Then you get Hammer and you get Dark Reign. And it's really cool with like all the things that transpired following Civil War. But the main event itself, from a philosophical standpoint, right? Like neither side was any more right or wrong than the other, right? And it kind of just made you question and ask like legitimate questions in all of this, right? Like, you know, Tony Stark is like we have to regulate. There's this really cool moment. I don't remember exactly who it was that he was talking to. I want to say he was talking to Steve Rogers, or maybe he was talking to Spider-Man and trying to convince Spider-Man to come over to his side. But there's this really cool moment where Tony Stark is talking about why he sides with regulation in Civil War, and he's like, "I'm a futurist. I look to the future, right? I don't really care about the present day." And he's like, "The problem with this is that if we don't regulate superheroes, something worse will happen, right? Like the government will just outlaw superheroes entirely, right? Or they turn on us." And in effect, he's referencing things like Days of Future Past. And if you've read stories like that, then you kind of tie that into Civil War as an indirect, inference. And it's just like, damn, this is really cool, right? This is really cool. But just the gravitas and the significance of it all. Superheroes going to war against each other with ideologies, and Captain America doing things that he wouldn't normally do. And the fact that top to bottom, everybody was involved in some capacity, right? That Tony Stark goes to like Heroes for Hire, Colleen Wing, and all those guys, and it's just like, go find Iron Man or go find Captain America. That's what you need to do, right? And it gives them like purpose, it gives them significance, stakes, right? The Thunderbolts make a return under Baron Zemo, and it's just like, dude, this is phenomenal. And then following that, you go into like Mighty Avengers under Carol Danvers with the first volume and all that kind of cool stuff. And yeah, like Civil War was just, I still say that was the best crossover event that Marvel's ever done in the history of their company. Like, it was phenomenal. Give me 1 second, guys. I gotta close my window.
Yeah, no worries.
But that's also the event that like they've chased since. Like Crisis on Infinite Earths is what I think of like DC. DC's always had Crisis since, and they've always kind of been chasing that whale in a way.
Yeah.
Civil War is the one for Marvel. They've always been trying to chase that in some way, even with Civil War 2. Yikes.
Hype wise, yes, but I think we're only just at a point now where we're just coming out of seeing like ramifications and story implications from the original Civil War. Like we're just at a point where like stories aren't totally referencing it, every 5 issues or whatever.
No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong, right? Because like even in Hickman's Avengers, the New Avengers, right? By the time you get to the very end, where you have Iron Man and Tony Stark fighting each other, right? And like, I'm sorry, Captain America and Iron Man fighting each other. And Steve Rogers is all aged up, after the nail storyline, he loses the super soldier serum. There's this amazing moment where like he shows up at where Stark's at in a War Machine suit. And Stark thinks it's James Rhodes. And when Captain America appears, he's like, "It's time to settle up, Tony." And it's just like, cool. So this has like been everything since Civil War, right? Like just the rivalry between the two. And in a lot of ways, it almost, not quite, but it almost matches the rivalry between like Reed Richards and Doctor Doom, right? And so it's like, and the crazy thing, like as by the time you get to the end of the story, it references back to the very beginning of Avengers from Hickman, right? Where he's like, there was light and there was dark, and one was good and one was evil. And basically, it's like they cancel each other out, right? Like ultimately, neither side wins, right? Evil dies, good dies, because like a helicarrier crashes into the two of them and kills them both while they're fighting each other. But no, I mean, yeah, 100% story implications, right? It just goes on and on and on and on and on. And even now, there's still, a little bit of rivalry between the two just from the events of Civil War. Right. Yeah. So no, you absolutely nailed it. And yeah, we're just getting to that point.
And even now, the writers who are writing comics now were reading Civil War when it came out. Like that's the stuff they came up with in a way. Yeah. So there's going to be some DNA there for sure.
Yeah, 100%.
One of the things that I always think about with Civil War that I feel a lot of people get wrong, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this, Rob, is people always say that the characters are out of character throughout that story. And I've always viewed it as they're in an extreme circumstance. And, obviously, like fighting Galactus is an extreme circumstance, but this is a scenario at which their lives are at risk. The way of life is at risk. and their ability to do what they do with the freedom with which they do it is at risk. And so everybody is escalating based on the other's actions. And so they both start at a pretty flat place, both sides. But as you know, Tony does one thing that seems a little extreme based on what's happening around him, based on being spat on by the mother of that kid, based on feeling guilty for the events of Civil War. Or rather, the events of the explosion. You know, based on those things, he ratchets things up. Then Captain America does too, because he feels he has people to protect, and he has a righteous justification for his actions. And so they keep one-upping each other, but I never felt that that was them being out of character. I felt like they were acting based on their circumstances. Would you agree with that?
I would. I would. It's Cale, right?
Yeah,
Sean.
that's right.
Yeah,
Well,
okay.
I know you're
Oh,
Sean, but I'm talking about yeah.
Cale, yeah, that's me.
Yeah. So to Cale's point, I wanted to make sure because I was always kind of like unsure if it was like Cale Cole or something like that. But yeah. So I mean, to Cale's point, right? Like story implications, right? So let's talk about. I mean, let's kind of go back to like Avengers and New Avengers for a second. I love that story. I'm always going to reference it as often as I can, right? If you read Civil War in a microcosm, 100% the characters act they're out of character, right? It doesn't really make any sense why they're doing what they're doing. But then you get to the very end of Avengers and New Avengers, Captain America, Tony Stark fighting each other, and you learn that Tony Stark knew the whole time that there was no way to stop the incursions. And like there's this point where Steve Rogers is like, you had us all running in circles. And Stark is like, of course I did. Right? Like if I had told you guys there was no way to save the multiverse, there's you guys, it would have all just descended into madness, right? I told you, Captain America, about the idea of building a better world, making Avengers world to give you busy work, to keep you distracted. Reed Richards runs on hope, right? Like I'm the only one that could actually see what was coming down the line. And when you take that kind of character development and then you apply it to Civil War, makes perfect sense that Tony Stark would do what he was doing. Now, it sucks that it took like a decade, right? 9 years to kind of get to that point. But the fact is that it makes perfect sense that Tony Stark would sit down and say, okay, so yes, this woman Miriam comes to me and tells me about how her child was killed, and I'm doing all this because of her. And sure, like looking at that in and of itself, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But then when you take a step back, you take that character development from Avengers and New Avengers and you apply it to Tony Stark in Civil War, then in turn, he's just kind of like, okay, so this became really big, really fast, and there's nothing I can do to stop it, right? This woman out there leading the charge against, with like regulating superheroes, doing something about superheroes, this cannot be done. It cannot be undone. It cannot be stopped. Public sentiment is way too strong. And politicians care more about power than they do anything else. And they'll do whatever it takes to keep it, which means if the general public is in favor of regulating superheroes, the government will regulate superheroes. And if we don't do anything, right, if we fight against it tooth and nail, the government will just wipe us all out. Right, like look at how they treat the X-Men, and so in again, looking at the characters on a surface level, 100%, right? But tying into Cale's idea about the idea of like plot threads kind of building after the events of Civil War, when you look at all the character development specifically for Tony Stark that came after, because the Iron Man movie and how popular he was and how much work was being done on his character, it kind of requires you to almost read between the lines, and say, like, if I'm Tony Stark and I'm a futurist and I'm always 20 steps ahead of everybody, how would I see this kind of circumstance? Well, of course, we have to go for regulation, right? Like, the alternative is that we basically face being outlawed and becoming fugitives of the law, and then Days of Future Past, right? So, in terms of like Spider-Man, revealing his identity to the world, that is a little wonky, but again, within the context of the story, it kind of makes sense because it was a way for Tony Stark to essentially manipulate Spider-Man, and then to like get him onto his side. But that's why the tie-ins become important, because over the course of the tie-ins, Spider-Man's just kind of like, I mean, I understand where Tony's coming from, but I don't know if I agree with it. But for the most part, he kind of sides with it until somebody shoots Aunt May. And now he's got something to lose. Now he's got personal stakes, right? And like the thing he feared the most, that folks would go after the people he loved after learning who he is, comes to fruition, right? It brings back the whole Gwen Stacy dying at the hands of maybe himself or Green Goblin situation. And so it's just kind of like, nope, walking away, right? And that's it. right? And then, of course, everything gets fixed from, one more day, brand new day, one moment in time, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I don't, Captain America, it makes perfect sense, right? That just with this kind of dogmatic approach to like freedom above everything else and disregarding any and all other possible scenarios, that he would 100% stand against the idea of government regulation of superheroes, right? Because this whole stance was like, this is one step away from government regulating people. There can be no room made, no quarter given to the idea of encroachment on people's civil liberties, because if you give you give the mouse some milk, it's going to want a cookie, right? It's always going to want more. It's always going to want more.
Yep, yep,
So from
yep.
from a philosophical standpoint, especially considering Captain America kind of living through World War II and everything that came out of it, it makes perfect sense that he would see where it came from. So no, I don't know if I would say the characters were acting out of character. They kind of acted exactly the way that you would expect, given the development that they had either up to that point in time or kind of retroactively applying future development to that story. So, yeah, no, it makes sense to me that they were doing what they were doing. Well, I mean, what do you guys think? What do you guys think? Do you guys think that they were all acting out of character in Civil War? Or you just kind of like, yeah.
I agree with
Well,
you.
yeah, I do too. And I want to take it one step further with Iron Man specifically. I wonder if this is one of the first times that a major philosophical stance happens with Iron Man. Because you have not too long before Civil War was Extremis, where Tony's armor is hijacked and basically enacts a terrorist plot. And then, all this stuff, everything happens with Civil War. And then, like you were saying, Rob, he sees the incursions happening in Hickman's run. I wonder if this is the moment when Tony Stark becomes a futurist, when this is a man who looks at everything and then starts to try to look past it to see what's coming and to prepare for it in that way that everybody says, as long as Batman has a plan, he can beat it.
Yeah.
Tony Stark wants to be that.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
I also think it's worth pointing out that when we're talking about Tony Stark, the Amazing Spider-Man tie-ins that came before Civil War started also add a lot that many people haven't read about Tony's motivations going into the Civil War. He explains it perfectly clearly when they go to Washington to have a conversation about the Superhero Registration Act before the general public knows it exists. And he makes the argument there that, hey, we don't need to do this. We've been allies to you guys for a long time and we've kept America safe and blah, 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 blah. But he knows that the wave of registration is coming no matter what he says and does. So he fabricates a scenario in those issues where he has the Crimson Dynamo come and attack Washington. And then he and Spider-Man stop it to show Washington why superheroes are necessary. He's trying everything he can to stop this from happening before it happens, but he can't. And so he just dives in and tries to make sure that someone he trusts, i.e. himself, is at the head of this thing. And I think that when you understand Tony's character, that makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's one of the reasons why I love Civil War so much, because it was also like the small moments, right? Like there's a point like Spider-Man doesn't deal with lawyers or anything like that, and Tony Stark deals with them on a regular basis. So there's this really amazing moment, like when they're sitting in front of a judge, right, or political committee of some kind, whatever it is, but like they're sitting there and Spider-Man's being asked these questions and he's answering them in a way where it's obvious he's not familiar with legal proceedings and whatnot. So there's a point where Tony pulls him aside after they're said and done, and he was like, okay, so here's the thing, you need to learn to talk like a lawyer. And Spider-Man's like, I mean, I don't know what that means. And he's like, if I ask you what time it is, what's the answer or if I ask you, do you know what time it is, what's your response? And he was like, well, it's such and such time. He's like, no, the response you give is, yes, I know what time it is. He's like, answer the question you were asked. And it's all those small little, moments that like go towards these little cool character developments and adjustments and changes and different things like that. And it's yeah, I mean, it's Yeah, I don't really consider the characters acting. The only thing that I will say that I think in terms of Civil War that felt kind of forced was the whole story arc with damage control and the whole idea of the extreme nature of Wolverine. I do love that like Wolverine was tasked with like tracking down Nitro, and I think it was really actually Wolverine's choice to try to find Nitro
Yep.
because of everything that had gone on. But like the extreme levels of his healing factor were ridiculous, right? Like where he
Yeah.
gets blown up
Yeah.
by Nitro, he gets incinerated down to his skeleton, and then he just like grows back like that. And it's just
Yeah.
like, so that we're doing now, we're just indiscriminately applying like
I
timetables.
I once I spoke with the editor of that book, John Barber, and he told me that that moment was one of the only regrets that he had about his time editing at Marvel because that shit didn't make any sense
Yeah.
and they couldn't explain it, but it was now part of canon that Wolverine can regenerate from a bomb.
Yeah, instantaneously, no
Yeah.
less. Like,
Yeah.
within minutes, like it's like okay, because it's so because I remember reading that at the time, and I'm like, okay, this doesn't make any sense because like in Days of Future Past, this is how he was killed, incinerated down to the skeleton, but here he just
Mhm.
returns instantly, and it's just like okay, like it just and I mean that's gonna happen, right? When you have like almost 50 years of separation between like a story
Yeah. Yeah.
between like two separate stories and two separate events. I mean, and it's unavoidable. But yeah, like the damage control thing. I mean, it made sense in given the context of Civil War, and the Civil War was as much a political story as it was a superhero story, but it just felt unnecessary. It's like so damage control is being ran by a crooked guy who's trying to secure government contracts, and it's just and he gave what is it, mutant growth hormone to Nitro, and that's how we're here. And it's like, okay, look, I mean, why couldn't it just be that Nitro was just a crazy asshole,
Yeah.
who just blew up Stamford, Connecticut, because the new Warriors were trying to make a reality TV show. I mean, why couldn't it just be that? But by no means is a takeaway from the story. So there's certainly instances, I guess, where maybe characters or aspects of the story, but and I will say, if people were to say that like Reed Richards was acting out of character with Prison 42, and that Hank Pym was acting out of character with Prison 42, and like throwing superheroes in the negative zone. On one hand, I would say I can totally understand where they're coming from, right? Like Reed Richards, like the head of the first family of Marvel of superheroes, is indiscriminately throwing superheroes into a negative zone prison where they're basically enduring some of the worst possible, treatment that they could endure, right? Thrown in a cell, given bread and water. It's in like, what is it? Bill Foster's just dead in a cell right after having had a hole blown in him by, Robot Thor, Ragnarok, I think they called him. But
Yep.
on the other hand, it makes sense that Reed would do that because there's also this kind of disconnect, right? Whether due to his social awkwardness or what have you, where Reed doesn't really grasp what it means to actually connect with other people in a meaningful way because he can't even connect with his own family, right? Like that's one of the beautiful things that came out of Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run a couple of years after Civil War,
Yeah.
where the Council of Reeds are like all these versions of Reed that had abandoned their family to solve the problem of everything and join the Council in the multiverse in the Citadel. And Reed almost did that. He was kind of like, I mean, there are more important things than like family and loved ones and things like that, and solving the problems of the multiverse, And so it makes sense that his character would do that in some ways. Ultimately, he didn't, but it kind of makes sense. So yeah, I don't know, man. Like I just tend to hand wave all that stuff away and just be like, Civil War's amazing.
Hell yeah, dude. Without spoilers for the future of my list, Civil War is in my top two, certainly.
Oh,
And
wow.
not
Same.
two.
Mm.
Um,
Not to spoil, but let me spoil.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I mean, people who listen to this
Yeah,
podcast
it's obvious.
know
Yeah.
my feelings. Shouldn't be a surprise. We really do have to move the show forward. Rob, you are welcome to hang out with us if you would like to. We have a
Sure.
little bit more show to do beyond our top five. But I really, really have enjoyed the hell out of this like little mini Civil War dissection because I could talk about Civil War all day.